Today I'd like to take us back to the very beginning of Homo sapiens as we know them. Archaeology and science discovered the remains of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam in the eastern portion of Africa, on the eastern coast of Africa. Y chromosome Adam, his remains date from about 275,000 years ago, and mitochondrial Eve's remains date to about 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. Mitochondrial Eve has the oldest strain of DNA linking to modern females' DNA today. Y chromosome Adam has the oldest or furthest back Homo sapiens strand of male DNA that we can find in any remains as of this very period in history. But these two great finds in archaeology and science give us the ability to kind of track how Homo sapiens spread across the globe. Now, there were other types of Homo beings on other species of Homo beings in other parts of the world, and let's go ahead and take a look at that. This map shows the spread of Homo sapiens across the earth. One thing I'd like you to notice about this map is that Homo erectus and Homo neanderthals were still on Earth and roaming the Earth during this period of the spread of the Homo sapiens. So this spread, of course, spreads first to northwestern Africa, to the Middle East, to Europe, Asia, and then in about 15,000 years ago, it begins to spread across the Bering Strait and down into the Americas, where we see the first Native Americans arise around 12,000 years ago, and South Americans as well. I think that it's a really interesting flow chart to see how man spread throughout the world, and it's very important to remember that even while Homo sapiens were spreading, that there were other Homo species on the earth at that time. The first text I asked you to look at this semester was a hieroglyphic text from the Old Kingdom, and it came directly off of the Old Kingdom walls. I'm showing you a rendering because the Old Kingdom was destroyed, and a new temple was built in its place. But these hieroglyphs would have come off of the inside of the walls here, shown on the drawing, and this becomes a very important foundational piece of Egyptian history. Now, there's one thing to remember about Egyptian civilizations and Egyptian literature as opposed to Babylonian Mesopotamian literature, which you're also reading this week. Egyptian civilizations didn't really care as much about uniting small tribes in their area. So you'll see with Egyptian cosmogonies multiple names for maybe one god. So you might see multiple names for the sun god Ra. Now this can be attributed to all of these little tribes having different mythologies about the same god. In Egyptian mythology, you can see gods with up to 50 names. So it becomes kind of a confusing mythology to follow, to really understand and track, because it is so different in so many different places. Whereas ancient Greeks and Mesopotamians were seeking to solidify their small tribes into one great civilization, Egyptians weren't so worried about that. That wasn't part of their thought process when writing. What we do see in these thought processes is something similar to song. We see a lot of repetition rather than what we would see in our own myths, which are narrative tales. We see more repetition and alliteration, rhetorical devices used, or literary devices used to kind of cement ideas into the human mind. And if you think about a song where you get a chorus or a refrain, it makes a lot of sense, especially since most of this literature arose out of oral traditions. It was probably a song. So of course there will be a chorus. There will be repeating phrases that you will see, which make it even more difficult to read. So I don't want you to get discouraged and think that Egyptian mythology is just the worst. It just has different parameters of literature than literature that you're used to reading. So let's move on. Okay, when I said that the old kingdom was demolished, new temples arose in their place. Here's a couple of examples of what new temples look like. The Temple of Isis at Philae is one of the best and most well-preserved temples that you can actually go and see today. The Temple of Ramses III, as you can see, has been crumbling and eroding for quite some time now. But these are what these old temples would have looked like. You would have entered through this main gate into other courtyards, and the temple would have been in the very, very back. So many of us have probably seen Egyptian hieroglyphs in the chart to the left. What's important to remember is that this is just kind of um, a code writing set for children. This is not how you read hieroglyphics. You can't assign a letter to a picture in hieroglyphics. It's more about a grouping of pictures and that creating a phrase. So you saw this when you read the PDF, but I just wanted to make sure that you realize that when you see these little hieroglyphic charts that help you to decode hieroglyphs, that those are not valid. I guess, decoding mechanisms for hieroglyphics. So I just wanted to let you guys know that, because oftentimes people will, oh, I'm going to decode these hieroglyphics, and they might use a chart like this, but that is not how it's done. It's not how the translation happens. And translation is very important when it comes to these myths, as we'll see with the Bible. It becomes a very important issue. And this hieroglyphs are different from cuneiform or cuneiform. Cuneiform was made with reeds, so they would pick maybe a piece of wheat or a piece of grass of some sort. They would clip it at an angle and use it to make these tick marks. And you can see on the right a version of cuneiform text here that uses these little tick marks. And these first arose for accounting purposes, to account for cattle and sheep and things of that nature. So, of course, tick marks, of course, are good for counting things. And then they developed into their own language, which I think is really cool. And this is what Enuma Elish was found in, the original language that Enuma Elish was found in. Now we have to talk about the area of origin for these Egyptian myths. As you know, settling on a river makes things a lot easier if you do not have transportation. You can build a boat, you have fresh water, it makes survival easier too. You don't have to be as nomadic because you have clean water. Things will grow in this area. But I want you to see the areas that these myths are coming from. This first one comes from Heliopolis. Another in your book comes from Memphis. So these myths are coming right out of the myth, or right out of the mouth of the Nile Delta here. So we see little different tribes and city-states all over the lower Egyptian area. Now, all of these areas had different myths with different names for the same gods, which is why these 50 named gods arise. Now, with Enuma Elish, we see a little different area and a little more stabilized area around Babylonian. What we notice about this area or this settlement is that it's right in the middle of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in between the Gulf Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So there is a lot of access to different areas via water canals of some sort. This is important to note. Of course, this is how we're going to see the rise of flood myths also, because everyone settled in a delta area, and what we know about the delta is that it floods. I want to look at some important parts of the history of the creation of the gods and of their world first, and let's just start with a glaring masturbatory secretion myth, a secretion creation that we see right from the beginning. Um, The myth says, the things which came into being of their births, even I, had union with my clenched hand. I joined myself in an embrace with my shadow. I poured seed into my mouth, my own, and sent forth issue in the form of shoe. I sent forth moisture in the form of Tefnut, saith my father Nu. Okay, so Nu created shoe and Tefnut through a masturbatory creation. This is part of the secretion myth. We will see masturbatory creations. We will see vomiting creations this semester. We will see um, nasal creations where people are snotted out. Secretion myths are not pretty, but it's a way of differentiating how humans are created from how gods are created. This is an asexual creation. No female is needed. But later on in the myth, we see that they understand where humans come from, because Set, Isis, and Nephthys, from the womb they came, one after the other of them. At the very end of the myth we see this statement: they give birth, and they multiply in earth this. So this scrambled syntax sounds an awful lot like go forth and multiply. And that is what they're doing, but they're specifically saying that these people come from the womb. Associating them with humans, whereas these gods that are created in secretion ways and primeval water ways or earth diver ways, emergence creations, all of these are meant to separate gods in the pantheon from the humans in the pantheon and create a sort of hierarchy. I'd like to focus a little more on the repetition we see in these early myths that will be repeated again in the Christian Bible. This idea of creeping things, this idea is all throughout the Bible. We see it in Genesis, we see it in Psalms. Anytime there's a mention of an animal, or many times where there's a mention of an animal in the Bible, we see and creeping things along with it. This can sometimes mean that they're hearkening back to a text, or this can be a common phrase for people in the area at the time. Another issue of that is the pouring of the seed. We see this in Genesis 38 when Judah took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamir. This is Genesis 38:6. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. And Judah said unto Onan, go in unto thy brother's wife, and marry her, and raise up seed to thy brother. And Onan knew that this seed should not be his. Onan felt bad about marrying his slain brother's wife. When he went in unto his brother's wife, that he spilled his seed onto the ground, lest that he should give his seed to his brother. So this is how they referred to semen a lot of times, as the seed for all life. So that's important to remember as well. If the phrase is exactly the same, they could be hearkening back. But this could also be a very common translation for certain combinations of hieroglyphs. The first myth we encounter in our book is the Enuma Elish, and it was discovered in the ruins of the palace of King Ashurbanipal of Nineveh in 1849. It dates to the 7th century BCE, and it's not in verse style, but instead it again relies on repetition, parallelism, puns, metaphors, and symbols to get its message across to the people. Interestingly enough, this myth is still recited at the New Year's festivals in Babylon every year. The children get out and they dress as Mumu Tiamat. They reenact the myth. It's a fantastic sight to see. I think this myth is fairly violent, but things that are important to note about this myth are that the gods often are angry at their children for being noisy or upsetting their stomach, or um, it's almost like postpartum, like the gods have postpartum. They can't deal with these screaming, crying children. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about how hard it must have been to raise a child in a time before diapers and formula and things like that, and medical care. Um, so you see this written into the myths, this idea of children being um, more than the gods maybe can handle. And another thing to note about the gods is the gods are really lazy. They want other people to do their work. I want you to watch this video, which explains much of the myth in a very nice way. Um, and then if you have any questions, please feel free to text me, email me, post in your journals about any questions that you may have about this myth. This is where we're going to end our study of the Egyptian mythology. There are many other myths, and you've read several of them. The point is that I want you to see the similarities in these myths. And how they're developing, how these myths are developing, how their ideas of creation are developing. So if you have any questions, please, like I say, um, get them to me in one of our forms of communication. Um, and I will be posting your next lecture on the Bible later today. Thanks.